Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you doing?
Hello, Nick and Terence. Doing well, thanks. Dealing with another 4 hours being load shat, but looking forward to the show today.
Yep.
Careful,
by load shedding this evening.
That is the past tense of load shedding. I'm sorry. It has to be.
So it's just good grammar. And of course, we're also joined by Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are things?
I'm waiting for my 4-hour shift this evening.
As am I. Isn't it glorious? All right. Speaking of Eskom, I suppose we might as well talk about it.
We have to.
We have to, because unfortunately, circumstances are forcing us to have to talk about this stupid SOE again. And we've got the sort of latest development now in the ongoing public squabble between De Ruyter and the ANC. The ANC has said that if De Ruyter didn't come forward with what they thought was good enough evidence that they have, that there is truly corruption among their senior levels, that they were going to sue him for defamation. And after the story in News 24, which suggested that De Ruyter didn't have particularly strong evidence, the ANC seems to be moving ahead with that. And they have gotten permission from the North Gauteng High Court to serve papers to De Ruyter, who is believed to be currently in Germany, although I'm not sure if that has been actually confirmed. The ANC wants the court to declare De Ruyter's statement to ENCA's Anneke Larsen defamatory and order him to retract. De Ruyter is not in the country anymore because he says that he fears for his life, and I think that's fairly justified. But this really doesn't feel like anything good is going to come from this. Terence, let me start with you. If the ANC manages to succeed in court and maybe getting some of the stuff declared defamatory, or even if there's just a sort of long court battle over it, it really seems to me as though De Ruyter is going to be under so much pressure that he probably doesn't say much useful in the public space anymore. What do you think?
Look, I'd just like to preface it by saying that if De Ruyter's in Germany, I understand Germany has its own power challenges. Just be careful about who you hire to fix things, because they don't always work out so well. As far as the ANC goes, they might find the German judicial system, moves faster than it does here. So but I understand we'll be getting to a story that touches on that issue a little later in the show. Look, I rather think that he kind of overextended himself. He made some really bold claims in the Anneke Larsen interview. I remember I watched that twice with rapt attention. But if he can't support it, if he can't, as we said in the beginning of the Zuma ascendancy, if he can't take the country into his confidence, then one is left to the sense that there are all sorts of shenanigans, but what he is doing is, to put it mildly, not helpful. Now, I understand fearing for his life and whatever. And maybe he is saying, as one might in Germany, had genoeg voor Zuid-Afrika geleistet. He gave enough for South Africa. He's not willing to, take the next step. I mean, I get that. But I think that in political terms, it does come down to a win for Team ANC.
Yeah, no, exactly. That is what I fear, maybe the sort of situation about this. And I can see the ANC in Parliament, if they do manage to score some kind of court victory here, saying, look, we've been vindicated by the courts, which, this would be no such thing. But it really does feel like this was a sort of a missed opportunity to really put the stamp on the damage that had been done to Eskom by corruption. Chris, what's your take on this story?
It's useful in indicating, I think, some of the pressure that the ANC feels to now try and find a particular scapegoat, as it were, to try and find this lightning rod. We didn't see this sort of action against I don't know, the Zondo Commission, for example, or anything like that. But you now see this one individual under this particular pressure by the ANC. I do agree with Terence about De Ruyter overextending himself. I don't think that therefore discounts what is happening and has happened at Eskom.
Yeah, sure.
But now, as it were, the burden of proof is on De Ruyter. If he still thinks it's something that he needs to deliver upon, whereas he might just think, well, sort of try to drop the truth bomb before he had to sign any particular non-disclosures or anything like that after he would have left officially. So maybe he's playing some sort of longer, different game. I'm not sure. But for now, his credibility, I think, is quite seriously undermined. Terence, I think Nick might...
No, I'm still here. My video
one.
just broke.
Okay.
So we're all good. Terence, do you have any final thoughts on this? It really does. We still haven't, I think, to my mind, seen conclusive evidence that De Ruyter doesn't have something to say here that's very meaningful. And if this does end up in court, I'm sure we will see whether De Ruyter does actually have the evidence.
Yeah.
But it does make me think that kind of when you're up against such tough competition, such entrenched networks, such high stakes, that you can't afford to make any mistakes that weaken your case.
Yeah. No, look, that fundamentally is where we are. And I don't think this augurs well for the fight against corruption in Eskom, such as that fight is, and I don't think it's being waged with passionate intensity.
All right, let's move on to our next story, and this is from also dealing with Eskom, and this is a little bit of good news, but with a bit of qualification, which is that a former Eskom administrative clerk who defrauded Eskom of approximately 2.6 million rand has been sentenced to 10 months in prison. Their co-accused is getting a suspended sentence for the same offense, presumably because they gave evidence against him. Nwabisa Nkola, I think is her name, was found guilty and sentenced by the Nelspruit Commercial Crimes Court on Wednesday. It's alleged that she committed this fraud in 2013 while working as an administrative clerk with Eskom. They colluded with the director of a company and submitted fraudulent invoices to Eskom for services that were never rendered to the value of 2.6 million rand. So someone's going to jail, which is always nice. But this really does seem like such a small fry thing in the grand scheme of things. Chris, what do you make of this?
Yeah, you could. I agree with you on the small fry point, but you could also look at the potential that smaller things can snowball, either positively or negatively. So it could be these small incremental things that are good in the long term in terms of getting some sort of financial stability and responsibility going in, or it could maybe be abused against political opponents, political municipality opponents in that sense, in a more negative and destructive way. So I do think it's noteworthy in a bigger picture if it's an indicative of any particular trend either way. It might be completely isolated and only happens now sort of really once off. On the other hand, I do want to just highlight how it doesn't in any way account for or make up for the wider damage and destructive state in which Eskom finds itself, especially its finances. And that doesn't get resolved overnight by by having one or two of these sorts of examples. You've got much deeper problems that I don't think there's the particular, not just the political will. That's too easy now in a lot of analysis to say there's no political will to solve these issues. I think even deeper, the incentives haven't changed. I mean, the incentives are there to keep your cadre networks, to keep employment equity, to keep that sort of political influence and power there. That would necessarily result in the sort of wastage in terms of financing. It's not an accident that this sort of stuff happened at Eskom.
Exactly, that's the bigger point. Is that corruption is, I think, often, and this is a point we quite often make on the shows. It's more like the symptom really than the cause of problems. It's a sign that the system is dysfunctional in some way. Speaking of dysfunctional systems, there is another detail that caught my attention in the story. So one of the reasons the co-accused in this case got a suspended sentence rather than a full sentence is that they had already spent 4 years in jail awaiting trial, which, oh man, that doesn't speak to the efficiency of the court system at all. Terence, any more thoughts on the story?
Yeah, look, it's good that that justice was done, that someone ended up in prison. But the times we're talking about are it just beggars belief. 10 years to bring this matter, or from the date of commission to the actually putting on your jumpsuit, and as you say, 4 years awaiting trial. Back in the 1980s, this was a big cause celebre, detention without trial. And I can't help thinking that there's a certain resonance there. People, some of our detractors, like to knock liberalism and liberals for being, soft-headed yokels who are, too sympathetic to criminals. But I'm telling you, you spend 4 years in prison before your case comes to court, and for something that you didn't do, you've effectively been punished. And I don't think that's I think that's something that should worry each and every one of us.
Yes, but I think we're going to have to do actually a whole topic one day on the state of our prisons, because they are nightmarish, and they are not performing the role they're supposed to perform in society, which is to punish and rehabilitate. They're sort of just these dens of dysfunction and misery. But let's leave that discussion for another day. Let's move forward to an interesting piece of information that's coming out of Zimbabwe. And this kind of makes us ask, I think, some dark questions about dictators and what encourages them to perform the way they do, and also the way that some people continue to hold such a place in our politics. And this is we've learned some interesting information about Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe, for a long time, hailed as the hero of Pan-Africanists, hailed by people in the EFF, some in the ANC, as a sort of great anti-colonial fighter. Of course, he had this fall from grace when he gets thrown out of power in a military coup, and then he died a few years ago. But it was always known that he was living a good life as essentially the dictator of Zimbabwe. But how good a life was not clear until recently, when his daughter's divorce came up from her husband, and some of the assets of the Mugabe family were revealed to the public at large. Listed in the divorce proceedings are 21 farms and more than 25 residential properties in the nice parts of Harare, including one valued at $40 million US. And there's not just in Zimbabwe, there's also an $8 million mansion in Dubai, apparently. The Mugabe family also apparently had multiple fancy cars of over $800,000 US. And disturbingly, with some sort of slight echoes, I think, to Pala Pala, according to the court filings, Mugabe also holds, quote, substantial cash in foreign policy, and there was a removed cash sum of $760,000 US in a bag from the couple's residence during the divorce proceedings. So this is all being squabbled over in court, but it really does feel like, to me, the proceeds, it sort of all seems like blood money to me. Terence, what do you make of this? Do you think this is going to be another dampener on Mugabe's reputation? Very undeserved reputation, but one that he still continues to hold, particularly in sort of the more kind of African nationalist corners.
Look, I think for people who, if Mugabe is the kind of thing you like, Mugabe is what you're like. I don't think that the fact that he was hog wealthy, or sent his kids to be educated in Hong Kong or whatever is really going to cut in the ice. I think that for the long-suffering masses of Zimbabwe, this is just another day in dysfunction. And I think this is It reminds me of something that an American commentator of Indian extraction once said, that to be wealthy in America, is really just about having lots of money and lots of toys. To be wealthy in a developing society means to hold a particular type of social status. I think to be wealthy in a dysfunctional developing society, where you hold political power as well, is to live a life that looks more like a kind of ancient emperor, where the world defers before you, and you are absolved of any kind of accountability. That's in what sort of parallel universe does a country with is it okay for a country that has Zimbabwe's scale of problems to have a politically connected young lady, to have like all this money in a bag, and that goes into your divorce papers, in a in a sort of crime family. That's something that you would hash out with a baseball bat, but this is something you try and do it legally. No, it's as Mark said, history repeats itself as tragedy and then as farce. Well, it's like for tragedy went through farce and came back to tragedy.
Definitely. This whole story of Mugabe is one that fills me with deep bitterness because of how he had this undeserved reputation, and we know that it was undeserved considering he was using North Korean trained troops to massacre people in the 1980s upon assuming power. But that he then lived this luxurious lifestyle, presumably by looting the public coffers or engaging in nefarious activities. And then even when he was deposed in a military coup, he still really didn't have his comeuppance because he went on to die of old age at the age of 95.
Look,
Chris, sorry, go ahead.
If I can just interject something there, I'm once again, I do my daily French stick and say that I'm old enough to remember. I'm old enough to remember Zimbabwe's independence. I was very young, but I remember that Zimbabwe was seen by many South Africans as a potential model, and this wasn't just soft-headed or sentimental thinking. They were, white emigres from then Rhodesia who actually went back to Zimbabwe, and would say that the big difference now is that it's safe and the race relations are good. Mugabe had a reputation as towards whites as something of a conciliator, not so much towards towards the ZAPU crowd, as you say, the North Korean Brigade, Matabeleland, and whatever. And that built a lot of his reputation. The other thing was that he was extremely articulate and extremely well educated, and this was something that he promoted in Zimbabwe. And apparently, in the 80s, every Zimbabwean diplomat, was studying an advanced degree at a foreign university. The educational standards of Zimbabweans even today puts us to shame. But, he had certain, there were things that you could hang on to, but the sort of dark underbelly was very inconvenient to the narrative. And I remember when Zimbabwe fell apart, speaking to someone who I attended university with, and saying, we never encountered this when talking about democratization in Southern African politics and whatever. Apartheid, colonialism was foregrounded, not the kind of what comes next and the dangers inherent in that. And I said, in Zimbabwe's case, actually, if you look below the surface, it was all there.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. Chris, your thoughts on the story?
Only that, it tends to, every time, it's not even the exception that proves the rule, but that the so-called vanguard of the revolution, trademark, tends to enjoy the best that crass materialism has to offer. Why have to deal with the basics that your followers have to deal with when you can enjoy the benefits of what the brute capitalism can give you.
And I think it's also, an indicator of how, because at the end of the day, a lot of Zimbabwe's problems were because of this authoritarianism that created no proper check on Mugabe's power, because of his sort of socialist leanings, which meant that when the country ran out of stuff, when it ran out of money, he would rather wreck it than give up power. And it's an indictment of the entire model that the kind of ANC EFF crowd wants to pursue in this country, which is that even if you can get, I don't know, 10, 20 years of good times, inevitably the bad times will come with that model. You need to actually create genuine growth.
Well, if I can point out something there. In the early 2000s, Zimbabwe got a very high international profile, and I remember that there were a lot of documentaries made about what was happening there. And I remember watching one on one of the DSTV channels. I'd like to say the History Channel. That was before it discovered that history was all about aliens being present at the first Thanksgiving and whatever. And I remember one of the interviewees was a kind of veteran investigative journalist. And he said apparently the first thing, the kind of first big issue was a relatively small scandal about buying luxury cars with public money, and he blew it open. And I remember just very chillingly kind of looked at the camera and said, "Yeah, and I lost my job for that." And basically that was sort of mid 80s.
And the moment those safeguards of freedom fall away, the potential for some mad political leader to drive the country into absolute destruction exists.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to our next story. And this is a couple of interesting things that are coming out of news from Pick n Pay, who've recently been talking about their yearly profits. Pick n Pay is actually doing okay considering the difficult economic climate. I think this matches a number of other retail groups, which I think Checkers is also doing quite well, which is quite interesting. But I'll leave that for the economists to talk about why that might be. One of the interesting facts of this is firstly that Pick n Pay is paying 500 million rand in diesel costs in order to run its diesel generators, and in terms of the net effect, this means that it's spending about 100 million rand because apparently they are saving 430 million rand on savings from not having electricity that they have to pay for. Although with the rising tariffs, I wonder how much longer that's going to be the case. But considering the enormous amount of money that Pick n Pay is spending on diesel generators and all large supermarket chains, the chairman, Gareth Ackerman, has said that the government is actually getting a weird kind of windfall tax from this, which is really annoying him, considering that this is creating a perverse incentive. He points out that 37% of the group's diesel costs go straight into the government's coffers through the Road Accident Fund levy, which has meant that essentially they are paying government extra tax for the benefit of being load shed. Chris, what do you make of this?
I guess those who can afford it,
a lot.
those who can afford it can deal with the failing state. Those who can afford it can manage to continue running operations, whereas others can't necessarily afford it. I mean, it could be easy to dismiss it as a quote-unquote conspiracy theory, but who gets to benefit from diesel supply? Who gets to benefit from importing more diesel, more refined fuel, that sort of stuff? Who might, in the CADA networks, benefit from a heavier reliance on diesel to power one's generators instead of having to rely on Eskom? I don't think one can discount that in the broader discussion, especially linking this to what we talked about earlier with what De Ruyter has alleged about Eskom and what goes on there. I think the numbers should point to and will hopefully lead to a bigger push on the part of at least some bigger corporates to say, where do we draw the line? Do we keep shifting this line in the sand, as it were? I mean, to it's not the exact quote, but Obama in Libya with the many lines in the sand. If they keep shifting, is it really a line, or do you just keep on bending over backwards? Where does corporate South Africa draw the line with the government, and in a way withdraw their consent?
Right. So just to push you on that, what do you think it would look like to that for the corporates to do that we could say they've withdrawn their consent?
It's a very good question, because you can weather these storms relatively versus smaller businesses. You can deal with higher compliance. You can deal with the Employment Equity Amendment Bill. Your profits continue being fine. Maybe at some point when some of them are forced to close down, I don't know, something like a Discovery or something like that, where their own business model no longer succeeds because they don't have customers, because people's cost of living is just so high, they can't afford some of these products anymore. Maybe then there will be a real realization. But secondly, perhaps only, and it might never come, but when there's a shift away from thinking that the current government, that there's good and bad elements in there, that you just need to give them more time, give them a new mandate, give them more control, those good guys versus the bad guys, and things will then change. I think there has to be a realization of it's not going to come from within the current government at any point.
Terence, what are your thoughts on the story?
Look, I think that supermarkets are probably somewhat shielded because so much of their business is with daily necessities, and there's a limit to what you can what you can cut there. If you look at things like if you go to any large shopping center and look for specialist stores, toy shops or whatever, most of those have gone now. They've been replaced by chains. I'm thinking, of the one just up the road from where I stay. Chalk and cheese from what it was in about 2007 to what it is now. Now, I think that as one of our viewers has said, corporates complaining, that's unheard of. I think this is starting to place a lot of stress on the ability to conduct any sort of profitable business. You can keep your head above water for so long, but sooner or later it's just not viable. I think a lot of corporates have partly tried to mitigate it by expanding offshore. Other markets in Africa. You see South African brands all over the place. But on the question of who benefits, I think Chris makes a very good point. One doesn't have to be a conspiracy theorist, but what happens is that faced with a situation, there's adaptation and there's a windfall that comes in. The government is of course very grateful for this because it's got to close fiscal gaps. But then within the government, there are those who say, well, we don't have to solve this problem that urgently because there's certain personal interests here that can feed on it. That is the problem with a compromised state.
All right, let's move very quickly on to our last story, which we're only going to go over very shortly. If you are in the tourism industry, you may know that South Africa has a special e-visa application process where you don't have to actually go to an embassy to apply for a visa from a number of countries. These countries are Cameroon, China, the DRC, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, India, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, the Philippines, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Uganda. So maybe one or two of those, maybe China and Saudi Arabia are places where and maybe India as well, I guess, places where you might get some tourists from, but not, the sort of bulk of the tourism industry. But it seems as though we only really have this e-visa system in theory. It came out during a discussion in the National Council of Provinces that 58% of all the failed e-visa applications that were submitted to the system were simply because the Department of Tourism just didn't get to them in time. They just didn't actually finalize them. And only 3.2% of the total received had been granted. So I don't really see the point then in applying for them. Chris, your thoughts?
Sorry, I was playing around with the mute button there. Look, you want, in the current global context of potentially lower growth, higher demand for skills, higher demand for investment, you want to make it as relatively easy as possible. So when you've got these particular sticky points, you increase your country's risk premium. Why would you undertake the issues with wanting to come and work here if you're going to have to deal with all the bureaucratic mess, regardless of which country you're from? So you might look at that list of countries and say, well, do you really want people from there? I think that's a very maybe lose point of view versus wanting to get as much skills development, entrepreneurial engagement, all that sort of stuff going as possible.
I believe quite a few Saudis actually would like to come and hunt here, and they have money for it.
No, and I mean, that's good for protecting wildlife, for example, the money that could be spent on conservation efforts. So all of this sort of stuff, I think, has a filtering effect, regardless of which countries someone might be from. If you make it more and more difficult, you continue to, number one, send, but secondly, in the current context, reinforce the message that why bother taking the time to come to South Africa?
Terence, in 20 seconds, your thoughts?
Look, this doesn't really hurt our tourism that much because most of our big markets are from visa-free countries. But yeah, it's a plan that's kind of half-heartedly and halfway executed. And where these sort of bottlenecks hit you at the sort of first your first contact with a country, which is a travel agent or whatever, you can find other places to do what you can do here. Case in point, South Africa, used to get a lot of tourism from Taiwan. They like the open spaces. They like to play golf. They like the wildlife. Well, you can go to Kenya to do that, or you can go to Australia, and it's a first world infrastructure.
Right. Always something to keep in mind. Okay, that's all we have time for this week. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we will be back next week on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.